It's a real pleasure for me to be here at Kyiv-Mohyla. I am somebody whose work has always benefited very much from the work of other people. And I'm very aware that my most recent book on Ukraine has benefited a great deal from the work of scholars and from the work of Ukrainian historians and Ukrainian archivists and people like you and your professors and your colleagues. And so I wanted to begin by thanking you for laying the groundwork by doing so much excellent work on Ukrainian history over the past decade. It's been really important for me and really important for everybody else. The most important work on Ukraine has always been done here. And the fact that I was able to use it and publicize it and take advantage of it in my book is really thanks to people like you. I'll begin by speaking a little bit about the famine, which is the main topic of my book, and then I'll move on. In the spring of 1932, the warning signs were very clear. The peasants of Ukraine were beginning to starve. Secret police reports and letters from all over the Soviet Union spoke of children swollen with hunger, of families eating grass, of peasants fleeing their homes in search of food. In March, a medical commission found corpses lying on a street in a village near Odessa, and also found that nobody was strong enough to bury them. Some peasants wrote directly to the Kremlin asking for an explanation and refusing to believe that Stalin himself even knew that this was happening. Every day, 10 to 20 families die from famine, they wrote. Children run off and railway stations are overflowing with fleeing villagers. The bourgeoisie has created a genuine famine here, part of the capitalist plan to set the entire peasant class against the Soviet government. But the bourgeoisie had not created the famine. The Soviet Union's disastrous decision to force Soviet peasants to give up their land and join collective farms, the deportation of kulaks, the supposedly wealthier peasants, the chaos that followed, all of these policies, all ultimately the responsibility of Joseph Stalin, the General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, these were what had led the countryside to the brink of starvation. And throughout the spring and summer of 1932, many of Stalin's colleagues sent him urgent messages from all around the USSR describing the crisis. And the Communist Party leaders of Ukraine were especially desperate, and they wrote him several long letters begging for help, begging Stalin, telling him what was about to happen in Ukraine. And many of them believed in the late summer of 1932 that a greater tragedy could still be avoided, and it could have been. The regime could have asked for international assistance, as it had done during a previous famine in 1921. It could halt grain exports. It could stop demanding grain from the peasants altogether. Instead, in the autumn of 1932, the Soviet Politburo, the elite leadership of the Soviet Communist Party, took a series of decisions that widened and deepened the famine, specifically in the Ukrainian countryside. They increased the state's demand for food in Ukraine. They required blacklisted Ukrainian farms and villages to contribute meat and vegetables as well as grain. They refused to halt the export of grain, which continued all through that year, because Stalin considered hard currency critical to his program of industrialization. They prohibited Ukrainian peasants from traveling to Russia in search of food. They blocked the roads between the countryside and the cities. And at the height of the crisis, they organized teams of policemen and party activists who were motivated by hunger and fear and a decade of hateful and conspiratorial rhetoric. For a whole decade, people had been convinced to believe that the peasantry were useless, they were worthless, they were stopping the revolution, they had to be eliminated. And these activists who had this hate speech and hateful language beaten into them for a decade, entered peasant households, and they took everything edible, potatoes, beets, squash, beans, peas, anything in the oven, and anything in the cupboard. They took farm animals, and they took pets, and sometimes they took money and clothes. The result, as you all know, was a catastrophe. Within a few weeks of Stalin's orders, Ukrainian peasants began eating horses and dogs and cats and rats. They cooked hedgehogs over fires, they fried birds' eggs, they ate the bark of oak trees. They ate moss and acorns and leaves and dandelions. They killed crows and pigeons. One survivor, Nadia Lutishin, remembered that frogs didn't last long, people caught them all. All the cats were eaten, the pigeons, people ate everything. I imagined the scent of delicious food as we ate weeds and beets. Some people survived because they'd managed to hold on to a cow or because they had a cousin or a friend in the bureaucracy. Some people slipped around roadblocks and escaped. Some people survived because the Soviet state, spotting another opportunity to exploit the famine, suddenly expanded its network of Torgson hard currency shops where peasants could trade gold and silver for food. People brought their wedding rings, their treasured jewelry, their watches, their Tsarist-era gold coins, things that connected them to their families and to the past, and they sold them for food. Some people even dug up graves in order to find more. As they grew hungry, many went mad. Law-abiding people began stealing food. Previously peaceful neighbors turned on the thieves and lynched them. Famously, there were instances of cannibalism. Police reported these incidents. They were all known. All the reports went back to Moscow, but there was no special reaction. As the situation became acute in the spring of 1933, Ukrainian peasants died in their homes, in their yards, leaving their villages spookily empty. As the death numbers spike, in particular between May and July, people traveled to railways trying to get out. They died in the railway stations. They tried to work and died in the fields, and they died in such large numbers that once again there was often nobody to bury them. But it's very important to remember that famine was only half the story, because while the peasants were dying in the countryside, the Soviet secret police, in other words, the same people who were organizing the famine, simultaneously launched an attack on the Ukrainian intellectual and political elite. As the famine spread, a campaign of slander and repression was launched against Ukrainian intellectuals, professors, museum curators, writers, artists, priests, theologians, public officials, and bureaucrats. And anybody who was connected to the Ukrainian People's Republic, which had existed for a few months in 1917, anybody who had promoted the Ukrainian language or Ukrainian history, anybody with an independent literary or artistic career was liable to be publicly vilified or jailed or sent to a labor camp or executed. Unable to watch what was happening, the Ukrainian communist Mykola Skripnik killed himself. The Ukrainian writer Kyiv-Mohyla killed himself too, and in his suicide note he spoke of the murder of a generation. In the wake of those attacks, thousands of Ukrainian churches were physically destroyed along with historical buildings and monuments in Kiev. And books were banned and art was confiscated, and even Ukrainian dictionaries were altered in order to make the language seem closer to Russian. Taken together, these two policies, so the Holodomor in the winter and the spring of 1933, and the repression of the Ukrainian intellectual and political class in the months that followed, brought about the Sovietization of Ukraine and the destruction of the Ukrainian national idea and the neutering of any Ukrainian challenge to Soviet unity. Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish lawyer who invented the word genocide, spoke of Stalin's assault on Ukraine as the classic example of his concept. He wrote, "It is a case of genocide, of destruction, not of individuals only, but of a culture and a nation." The question is, why? Why did Stalin do it? And why did so many people go along with his decision? And so to understand the origins of the Bolshevik animus against Ukraine, it's very important to go back in time. After all, when Stalin was thinking about Ukraine in the early 1930s, he was not dealing with a new problem. And in this story, as in so many others, the event makes no sense unless you understand the prehistory. For the Bolsheviks, the problem of Ukraine has a very precise starting point, which is 1917. And this is a year not of one revolution, as we commonly misremember, but of several. And in Moscow, of course, there were two. There was the street revolution in February and the Bolshevik coup d'etat in October. But in Kiev, there was a third revolution, as you know, and it was spearheaded by a group of intellectuals, led, I am glad to say, by a historian, Mikhail Hrushevsky. And from the first moment they appeared, the Bolsheviks sought to undermine them. Why? Because the Ukrainian leadership, the national leadership, was revolutionary, but it was not Bolshevik. And their economics were very radical and included the demand for the compulsory redistribution of land. Ukraine, remember, was still a largely peasant nation, and most Ukrainian speakers then were peasants, and the Ukrainian Revolution was carried out with them in mind. But their politics were radical too. As Imperial Russia collapsed, Ukraine's leaders demanded to be part of the spring of nations that blossomed across the region. Within months, Poland and Czechoslovakia and the Baltic states and others would all gain statehood and international recognition, and Ukraine wanted to join them. But this desire ran immediately counter. It was in contradiction to the Bolsheviks' priorities and even counter to their understanding of the world. And as men educated in the Russian Empire, they had difficulty imagining a sovereign Ukraine. For them, the territory of Ukraine, which was long a Russian imperial colony, was a region they knew as South Russia. As Marxists, they had mixed feelings about peasants whose revolutionary credentials they doubted. And they also knew that, as revolutionaries, that the Tsar had been toppled by bread riots, and they had no mixed feelings at all about the loss of access to Ukrainian grain. So, for God's sake, Lenin wrote to his comrades fighting in Ukraine in January 1918, use all energy and all revolutionary measures to send grain, and more grain. Otherwise, Petrograd may starve to death. Use special trains and special detachments. Collect it and store it and escort the trains. Inform us every day. Nobody was more sensitive to this call than Joseph Stalin, who was, at that time, as many people don't remember, directly responsible for Bolshevik policy in Ukraine. As the People's Commissar for Nationalities in the first Bolshevik government, he not only denounced the Ukrainian Declaration of Sovereignty in 1917, he followed up with what we would now call active measures, psychological games intended to destabilize the Ukrainian government. So in a number of cities, local Bolsheviks tried to establish so-called independent Soviet republics, tiny Moscow-backed mini-states, which bear a striking resemblance to the Donetsk People's Republic of today, and which were, of course, not independent at all. In Kiev, he tried to carry out a coup d'etat, and in Kharkiv, they sought to create a rival Ukrainian government. Eventually, they conquered Kiev in 1919, and this time they stayed in power for several months. They established a secret police force, carried out mass arrests, started to requisition food, all policies that angered people who were already in 1919 exhausted by several years of war. And the result, as some of you know, was a massive, violent peasant rebellion, probably the largest ever to take place in Europe. Leaders of this Ukrainian rebellion were various, ranging from the populist Grigoriev to the anarchist Makhno, but the peasant participants were united in their overwhelming hostility to the Bolsheviks, to the grain requisitions, and to their repression. Many people believed in the ideals of the far left for bread and peace and land, but they hated the Soviet Communist Party, which they perceived as a foreign body in Ukraine. An observer who visited Ukraine on a Red Cross mission at the time paraphrased Ukrainian thinking like this. He said, "A special peasant phraseology was formed. We are Bolshevists," said the peasants in the Ukraine, "but not communists. The Bolsheviki gave us land while the communists take away our grain. We will not allow the Red Army to hang the commune about our necks. Down with the commune, long live the Bolsheviks." And as you can see, so confused was the terminology at this time that the sentences could easily have been written the other way around. Down with the Bolsheviks, long live the communists. But the point was clear. Ukrainian peasants had wanted one form of revolution, but they had gotten something else altogether. That rebellion destabilized everything: the Bolsheviks, the Ukrainians, the economy, and Ukraine collapsed into chaos. At the height of the anarchy, white imperial forces under the command of Denikin, Anton Denikin, a former Tsarist general, advanced into the Donbass, Kharkiv, and Odessa. Eventually, they marched north, coming within 200 kilometers of Moscow. Denikin failed to make common cause with the Ukrainians or the Poles, and so eventually he lost. But for a very brief and terrifying moment in the autumn of 1919, the Bolsheviks were frightened. Suddenly it seemed as if Moscow would fall. It didn't, but the Ukrainian peasant uprising had brought the counter-revolution to the brink of success. And this close call was very long remembered at the highest level of the Soviet regime. They used to speak of the cruel lesson of 1919, and this was often debated and discussed for many years afterwards. The memory that chaos in Ukraine and the Ukrainian refusal to go along with the Soviet system had almost led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, that Ukraine posed an existential threat to Russia. This fear was never far away. It led to some milder policies in the 1920s, as those of you who study history know, and a new economic policy. But even a decade later, in 1928, I found a document in which two secret policemen in Moscow were writing to one another, and they were writing an internal report on the state of the Soviet countryside, and they referred again and again to the events of 1918. They recalled how the kulaks and the rural bourgeoisie, led by anti-Soviet parties, had fought the Bolsheviks. They talked about a kulak uprising, and they feared it could happen again. And the same fears haunted Stalin himself in the early 1930s as his collectivization policy began to fail. He once again became fixated on Ukraine. In the summer of 1932, as it became clear that the grain production was very low, he wrote a letter to one of his sidekicks, Kaganovich, who had long functioned as representative in Ukraine, and I quote, "The most important issue right now is Ukraine," said Stalin. "Things in Ukraine have hit rock bottom." He feared treason. He feared the influence of Poland. He feared Pilsudski, who had of course, worked together with Petlura in the 1920s. And above all, he feared Ukrainian nationalists who were still faithful to their former leader, to Simon Petlura. And I quote again, "Unless we begin to straighten out the situation in Ukraine, we may lose Ukraine." And losing Ukraine for Stalin was impossible. It was unthinkable, because what did his own experience tell him? That unrest in Ukraine is uniquely dangerous. It might once again bring counter-revolution to the outskirts of Moscow. So the decisions that he took in the autumn of 1932, decisions which deliberately intensified and strengthened the famine. As I said, it was a Soviet-wide famine, but there was a series of orders passed in that fall which isolated Ukraine, which decimated Ukraine's leadership, which hollowed out Ukraine's cultural institutions and repressed its language. These were Stalin's way of ensuring that the Ukrainian national movement would die out and that the Ukrainian rebellion would not repeat itself ever again. Except, of course, that it did. In 1991, Ukraine voted to become independent, and just as Stalin had feared, that decision helped to bring about the end of the Soviet Union. Because it was so devastating, and because it was so thoroughly silenced, and because it had such a profound impact on the demography and psychology and the politics of Ukraine, it is unsurprising that the Ukrainian famine continues to have an echo long into the present, and that it continues to affect the way that people in this region, people in Russia and Ukraine, think about themselves and about one another in ways that are both obvious and subtle. I mean, you here in Kiev, and particularly you at this university, you know better than anyone else that the physical destruction of Ukraine's elite, people like yourselves, in the 1930s, the nation's best scholars, the best writers, the political leaders, as well as its most energetic farmers, that this destruction continues to matter. In 1933, the men and women who would have led the country, the people who they would have influenced, all these people were abruptly removed from the scene. The structure of the countryside was turned upside down. Village councils were replaced by party committees. In the cities, the best scholars lost their places and were replaced by second-rate people, by opportunists, by people who were much more willing to work with the regime. And of course, worse than that, that means that the people who led Ukraine in the aftermath of the famine and the arrests, even when they were good people, and of course some of them were frightened into silence and obedience. They were taught to be wary and careful and cowed. In subsequent years, the state itself became a thing to be feared and not admired. After 1933, politicians and bureaucrats in this country, and in this, it was then a republic and now in this nation, were never again seen as benign civil servants. Whatever admiration the state had held, whatever role it had played as something to be respected, as something to be trusted, this fell away after the 1930s, and it was never replaced. Of course, the Russification that followed the famine also left its mark. Thanks to the Soviet Union's systematic destruction of Ukrainian culture and memory in the wake of the famine, many Russians don't treat Ukraine, even today, as a separate nation with a separate history. Many Europeans are only dimly aware that Ukraine exists at all. But I know that outside of this room, I know there are Ukrainians themselves who have mixed and confused loyalties, and that ambiguity can sometimes translate into apathy. Certainly those who don't care much or know much about their nation aren't very likely to work to make it into a better place. There's a way in which the history of Ukraine, Stalin's obsession with Ukraine as a particular danger to the Soviet Union, also repeats itself and also finds an echo, if not an exact replication, in the thinking of some of Russia's leaderships today. Why was it in 2014 that Putin found the sight of young Ukrainians on the Maidan waving European flags and calling for a struggle against corruption? Why was that so challenging to him in Moscow, so far away? It didn't affect him. It didn't seem to have any impact on him. What was it that upset him so much that it led him to conduct a military operation against Ukraine? And the answer is that although Putin is not Stalin, he has this in common, in that for the current Russian leadership, Ukraine is a unique problem. What happens in Kiev is believed to have an impact in Moscow. The revolution that took place here 3 years ago was exactly the kind of revolution he is afraid of in Moscow. He fears this. He fears young people. He fears the EU flag. He fears the idea of rule of law. He fears the idea of democracy. These are all concepts. These are ideas that threaten. I don't believe that they were a threat to Russia itself. I think it would be good for Russians if Ukraine were a prosperous place, if Ukraine were integrated with the rest of Europe, if Ukraine, everybody prefers to have rich neighbors, it's better than having poor neighbors. But the language and the ideas that were at the forefront in 2014 are a direct threat to him and to his form of autocratic, oligarchic government. And that was why he felt this need to react. Ukraine is not a place for him that is just another republic or another neighbor. It's not Lithuania, it's not Poland. It's something that has existential importance to Moscow. And I think we see that in the unusual way that he reacts to events here. But the lesson of 1991 and the lesson of 2014 is that history also offers hope as well as tragedy. In the end, it's very important to remember that the famine failed. Ukraine was not destroyed. The Ukrainian language did not disappear. The desire for independence did not disappear either. And more importantly, neither did the desire for democracy or for a more just society, or at least for a Ukrainian state which truly represents Ukrainians. More than once in the past 25 years, Ukrainians have been offered the chance to remake their country. You have it again. Luck and geopolitics and the civic passion that drives so many Ukrainians to want a better and fairer and more prosperous country have propelled Ukraine in a different direction from some of its neighbors. In the course of writing this book and discussing and debating the subject, many people have wanted me to focus on memorials, on UN resolutions, on the question of genocide. And as I've said many times, I do believe the famine was a genocide. But I also believe that it would be, while it would be good for the world to recognize the famine as a genocide, and while I'm in favor of memorials and museums, and of course I believe the famine should be a subject of study in Ukrainian schools, as well as in schools in Europe and elsewhere, I do think that the most important monument to the famine, the best way to pay homage to the victims, to your grandparents, to your great-grandparents, is not through memorials and museums. Even better than that would be to build a country in which nothing like the famine can ever happen again. A Ukraine which is law-abiding, a Ukraine where government institutions are trusted because they really do serve Ukrainians and not the people who work in them. A Ukraine where elected officials think of themselves as public servants. A Ukraine where ordinary citizens participate in politics, taking the time to vote, to read, to be active in the management of their villages and buildings and factories and towns and cities. A Ukraine where it is not possible to whip up hatred against neighboring countries, where it is not possible to set one part of the population against another. The famine could not have happened if Stalin had not convinced some Ukrainians that other Ukrainians were evil kulaks, enemies of the state, enemies of the people. Partisanship, which shades into ethnic or political rivalry, which then shades into violence. If you can build a Ukraine where that is impossible, then you will make another famine and another tragedy impossible too. So again, the history of the famine is a tragedy and it has no happy ending. But the history of Ukraine is not a tragedy. Millions of people were murdered, but the nation remains on the map. You are here. The memory of the famine was suppressed, but Ukrainians like you can discuss both the past and the future at institutions like this one. You can reconstruct and you can build. And although the wounds of the Soviet era are still there, millions of Ukrainians and people like you can finally begin to heal them. Thank you very much.
Very insightful talk. As I said, we have plenty of questions, and please feel free to approach the microphone and you can ask questions from there. And meanwhile, I will go through the list, and there are quite a few questions about the leadership. What does it take to be a leader? The role of the young leader in the world, and there are some less very important questions also. For example, and let me start with this question. Somebody asked, how do you see the future of Ukraine in next 10 years? What opportunity we will have? What may change?
So I'm a historian, and you've just asked me to predict the next 10 years. Is that right? I really do the past, not the future. Look, Ukraine has, for the first time in its history, there is a geopolitical moment which has allowed you to become truly independent and truly sovereign for the first time. You've had this for 25 years, and you got in 2014 the chance to renew that possibility once again. Taking advantage of this moment and actually, despite the war in the East, taking advantage of the difficulties many of your neighbors are having, the internal quarrels already, taking advantage of this moment to rebuild your institutions. I've said one of the oddities about Ukraine, and you can see it in the history, and you can also see it in the politics of the last several years, is that Ukrainians are unbelievably good at creating civic institutions. Creative, energetic, building responses, creating responses to emergencies, both your responses to the Maidan, your responses to the invasion, some of your responses to the disinformation campaign have been amazing, but but Ukrainians have been less good at building state structures. In other words, institutions that can last over time, that can represent Ukraine in the world, that can control the government, that can distribute tax money. You've been less good at that. I mean, if Ukraine can take advantage at this moment when you have sovereignty, you have positive mood from your country, you have goodwill from at least some of the world to do that, then I think you'll have 25 years from now, you'll be a much stronger country. But there are challenges coming. We may see at least some disintegration of Europe and the European project over the next few years. We may see some unrest in Russia over the next few years, and you are going to be in the middle of both of those conflicts. And the stronger that you can be, and the more loyalty you can build among your own citizens, the better your chances are of surviving and remaining prosperous. Sorry if I know those are general words, but...
Thank you. You're completely right. We have to be stronger because challenges are coming and everybody is predicting that.
And thank you for your lecture, and I want to ask you 2 questions. The first question is about the reasons why Stalin stopped the famine in 1933. Because we can realize why he started it, but it's hard to understand the reasons for stopping it. And the second question is about the prospects of Russia. Do you believe in democracy in Russia on the area of internationally recognized on the internationally recognized area of Russia?
Why Stalin appears to have stopped the famine. I don't have access to his thinking, but the best guess we have is that Stalin's intention was never to murder every single Ukrainian. That was not the point of what he was doing. The point was to undermine the national movement and to weaken the peasantry so that it would be possible to Sovietize the republic. And so once several million people had died, there was no need to continue the famine. And it ends actually very slowly. It ends really when the harvest comes in 1933. They slow down the grain requisitions. They, at one point, almost stop them. And they simply allow people to start eating again. I mean, remember, they needed some Ukrainian peasants to continue to bring in the harvest. I mean, Ukrainian grain was very important to them, and the goal was never to kill everybody. That wasn't the kind of thinking we're dealing with. The goal was to weaken it. So that what Stalin was afraid of was peasant rebellion of the kind they'd had in 1918. And as I explain in the book, which goes into this in much more detail, they also had a peasant rebellion again in 1930 after collectivization. So what he wanted to do was make sure that never happened again. That's how I understand it. So Russian democracy. I mean, look, I was part of a couple of projects in the 1990s which sought to not teach democracy, but discuss. I was part of a kind of a school in Moscow that did a lot of training of people, and in the hopes that they could at least seed some, help people begin thinking democratically in Russia. I don't think it's impossible. Countries do change. This country has changed, and you can change the way nations think. You can change the way that people think. I don't think it's impossible that you could persuade Russians that there's a better way to run their country. I think actually there's a lot of discontent in Russia with the way things work. But right now you have a group of people in power who are, it's not just that they are not Democrats. They actually see Western-style liberal democracy as their main ideological threat. They see it as a kind of enemy. And they are working very hard, both in the kind of propaganda they do, in the foreign policy they follow, and in many other ways. Not just to prevent their own country from becoming democratic, but to undermine democracy everywhere else. So it doesn't feel right now like the prospects are very good for a democratic Russia in the next, in the foreseeable future. But I don't think no country is genetically programmed to be undemocratic. There are certainly forces inside Russia that think differently. There always have been. It's even possible that if Ukraine were to become a successful democracy and were able to offer some kind of alternative, then I think that would have a good influence in Russia as well. That's the best I can do to answer it.
Thank you.
I would like to ask a question from the list. Some of the questions are more personal, and one of these questions, how did you decide to become a journalist? Was it your dream since childhood or just an opportunity occasion?
So, how did I become a journalist? I'm probably a journalist because I can't write novels. I'm not very good at making stuff up. But I was somebody who read a lot as a child, and I couldn't really imagine doing anything that didn't involve writing. And so, actually from the time when I was at university, when I was your age, I worked at a university magazine. I wrote articles then, and I found a kind of, and to be honest, I never really wanted to do anything else. I had a moment of thinking maybe I would be an academic, maybe I would get a PhD, and I failed to do that. And so fortunately, you're giving me one today, which I didn't manage to earn myself. Probably what really made me into a journalist and convinced me that this was the right thing to do, I was very fortunate, and I was living in Poland in 1989 at the time of the collapse of communism. And this was really, for me, a transformative thing to watch and witness. And the feeling of being in a place where something important is happening and wanting to describe it and explain it in a way that people far away can understand it. This, in a way, is something I keep doing even in my history books. Remember Warsaw, I'm from Washington, D.C., and from far away in the United States, it was very, people understand cliches, but they didn't really understand the details of what was going on. And so the ability to explain it, I've always thought of myself as someone who explains very complicated things in a way that is, people who aren't from there or people who are from a different culture can understand. And I guess since 1989, I've wanted to keep doing that. But by the way, I should say one thing about journalism that can be honest to its subject. In other words, reflect to try and be as true as possible, and yet can be understandable to people who don't know as much about it. This, to me, is the essence of really good journalism.
For this very beautiful speech that you made, and it is very timely that you come here to Ukraine now, as in a couple of days we will be commemorating the Red Famine and what has happened before, and Ukraine has had these dark pages. But my question would be, as you rightly mentioned, that there are many people in Europe, in the United States, that may not be that interested in Ukraine. They're asking themselves a question, why bother about Ukraine? And now, writing this book about a very particular time period, I guess I have two questions. One would be, how do you sell this? How would you explain to the international community of the importance of learning about this particular episode in Ukraine's history? Can this episode actually inform what is happening now, and can that be put into a more global context? And another one is a more personal one. What has inspired you to write this book? I understand your interest in this part of the world, but maybe there was a specific reason why you have decided to write this book now at this particular time. Thank you.
So one of the things you should know about why I wrote this book now is that actually I started it in about 2012. So I didn't write the book as a response to current events. It emerged that and believe me, when the events, it almost was the other way around. Because I was writing this book, in 2014, I became very alarmed by what had happened in Ukraine. And as some of you might know, I wrote a lot about Ukraine at the time, and broadcast about Ukraine, and that was because I just spent 2 years reading about the famine. So it actually, in my head, it worked the other way around. The inspiration for the book was partly an academic one, in that you know that you have a very good Ukrainian institute at Harvard. And some of the academics who are there convinced me that it was possible to tell this story in a new way. So my previous history books had also been written for that the idea was that you could use archives in a new way. That instead of writing vaguely about the famine as the result of chaos and so on, you could actually pinpoint the decisions that Stalin took and when he took them and why those were targeted at Ukraine. And so the book is it's an old story in a way, but you could tell it in a new way. And also they told me, look, all these fantastic Ukrainian historians have been working on it for a decade. There's all this new material they've found, can't you use that? And that was the reason for it. I mean, my interest in Ukraine dates back a very long way. I first came here in 1991. I went to Lviv, 1990. I went to Lviv even before Ukraine was independent, and I had met the leaders of RUK, because they were then at that time, and so I've followed the development and trajectory of Ukraine ever since then. I also see Ukraine as a really important piece of the puzzle in Europe. I genuinely believe that a kind of independent, stable, prosperous Ukraine, which is integrated with Europe and hopefully friendly with Russia, is a source of stability for all of Europe. I mean, as some of you know, I have connections to Poland. I believe that Poland's safety is very much dependent on Ukraine being a strong and stable, prosperous democracy. And so my interest in Ukraine, also comes from my sense of its importance in this broader picture. As for the story of the famine, remember, ask yourself how much you know about, the history of Venezuela or the history of Uruguay, and is it really important to you in your daily life? Don't be angry at people in the West for not knowing the history of Ukraine. I mean, there's a way in which it seems far away and unimportant to a lot of people in London or Paris, in the way that other faraway countries seem unimportant to you. I mean, this will sound like I'm repeating myself, but the more prosperous Ukraine becomes, and the more important it becomes in European politics, and the more it becomes a country that people have to listen to because it's stable and it plays an important diplomatic and economic role, the more you do that, the more people will care about your history. So in a way, it's not so much a PR question. It's not about selling Ukraine abroad or getting your diplomats to talk about the famine. It's more that by making yourself a country that matters, people will then will ask, will be interested in. I mean, I think in a way, as I said, accidentally, my book benefits from the fact that Ukraine is fighting a war against Russia. People pay attention to Ukraine because Ukraine fought back, because it has a clear sense of identity, because it has politicians who are now trying to make, trying to play a role in the world, and people are suddenly interested. What is this country? We've never heard of it before. Maybe we better read a book about it. I mean, in a way, that's how it works. People will be interested in Ukraine, and then they'll say, why don't I know about this? I need to read a book about Ukrainian history. Other than that, I mean, go on. The more work your historians do, and the better, the more material you produce, the more attention you get. I mean, as I said, I used Ukrainian historians' work, and other people will too. Thanks.
A question from this list. It's a kind of strange question, let's put it this way, also it's getting personal. In Ukraine, quite often, well, not quite often, sometimes politicians, people with money approach writers, journalists, and ask them to write a book, and then they pretend with people with the money that they wrote this book, and journalists get, the money and so on. So the question that somebody asked you, I'm not changing the question. How many times have you received proposals to write not your own text for money from government or and so on?
So I've never had a proposal like that. But I mean, there is a thing called a ghostwriter. I mean, lots of politicians in the West also pay people to help them write their memoirs. It's not actually, you know, this is a known practice. It's, you know, and very often people will thank the ghostwriter in their acknowledgments. You know, you can see it in, you know, in books by American former presidents and so on. So it's not, it doesn't necessarily have to be a corrupt practice. Nobody's asked me to do that, but, you know, maybe they just don't like my writing, I don't know.
Or they are scared to approach you.
Sorry?
Maybe they are scared to approach you that they would say no.
No, you know, I don't have it, you know, one has to be careful. I mean, ghostwriting is as we call it, is you know, some people do it to make money and they can't make money writing their own books, so that's what they do. I mean, it doesn't have to be immoral or illegal. It can be, you know, if you're open about what it is, then yes, sure, I helped. I mean, very famously, Trump's ghostwriter has been writing a lot recently. He wrote a book called The Art of the Deal that was actually written by somebody else. And the person who wrote that book now feels very guilty about it. He feels that he invented this character of Trump that then became reality. And he's wrote a very funny article in the New Yorker describing his experience writing this book. So it's not unheard of. You know, but if you can be transparent about it and you can explain, sure, I'm helping. Not every famous person, you know, not every rich person or every politician is a very good writer. And so the skill of being a good writer doesn't necessarily transfer to politics. So I don't think it's necessarily immoral. It's just, you have to just be, as I said, be transparent.
Thank you.
And I want to ask you a question. Is it possible to defeat the idea of communism in our modern world and post-Soviet countries?
Sorry, is it possible?
Is it possible to defeat communism?
To defeat communism?
Yes.
It depends what you mean by communism.
The idea of communism, which try to destroy the democracy and make people not make one second.
No, I understand. No, I understand what you're saying. I mean, you know, real existing, you know, communism was defeated in this part of the world in the sense that there are, you know, China is a separate question, and North Korea and Cuba are separate. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about here. You know, I think communism, Marxist ideology, was defeated in that. I mean, I know there are still small groups who believe that. That the Soviet system should be revived and so on, but I don't see any of them running countries. I don't see any of them running societies, and so I don't think, you know, that's a huge threat. But the pattern of thinking that is represented by communism, in other words, that we need, you know, a one-party state, and that opposition should be undermined or destroyed, and that there's no such thing as legitimate opposition. This kind of, it's not really Marxist thinking, but it's really Leninist thinking. This does persist, and you can see it now coming back in a lot of European countries. You can see it coming back here, and the best argument against it is to make a clear and sort of more muscular argument for not just democracy, but for liberal democracy, in the sense that, you know, we need societies which are strong, not just because we've elected the leader, and you know, but because they have checks and balances on the leader, that we have a neutral civil service, that one party is not allowed to dominate state institutions. You know, you need to argue and explain to people why that's the best and fairest and most just way to run the country. And then you defeat this kind of neo-Bolshevik or kind of new Leninist way of thinking about politics. That would be my my argument.
And what's about post-Soviet countries, such as Russia and Belarus?
You want me to overthrow Russia and Belarus right now? I'm sorry. No, I can't give you a formula standing here in a few seconds for how you undermine Russia and Belarus, but I do think that this argument for liberal democracy and for why it can best succeed, if you are able to make it here, and if you can make it work here, that will be the best thing that you can do.
Thank you.
Thank you. The question again, you don't have to answer that question, it's not personal. Are there any Ukrainian writers who are worthy of the Pulitzer Prize?
Oh, I can't answer that.
Okay, I go to the next one. How can we increase the trust for media? What are the best ways to stop spreading fake news?
So this problem of how you create trustworthy media is one that we now share with you. This is a problem in the United States, it's a problem in Britain, it's a problem in Poland, and it's a problem here. This is not unique to Ukraine, and it's not uniquely to do with Russia, in fact. I think it's much deeper, and it's to do with the ways in which social media and the changes in the way media is financed have undermined both the authority of traditional media sources, but also their business models, so that you have very weak and sensationalist newspapers and television now competing with hundreds and hundreds of websites, blogs, social media, and so on. I mean, this is a real information revolution of a kind that I don't think we've really had since the invention of the printing press. And if you know some history, you know that when the printing press was invented in Europe, it led to it did many, many good things. It increased literacy. It meant that more people could read, just like social media has also done many good things. But it also undermined the authority of the Catholic Church, and it made the Reformation possible. And the Reformation was also, it's also a good thing, particularly if you're a Protestant. I'm not sure if there are many of those in the room, but if you are. It also led to several centuries of religious wars in Europe. Really the worst crisis in European history before the Second World War were these terrible fights between Catholics and Protestants in one country after the next. And it really wasn't until, you could say, until the 18th century, the Enlightenment and the idea of religious tolerance made it possible for people to live in peace again. I genuinely think that we are at that kind of moment now. And the way in which social media has undermined not just, by the way, media, but also all institutions, is now something we all have to live with. I think the answers to it there's not one single answer, there are multiple answers. Some of them have to do with the way media works now. Can we reinvent journalism in a way that is more constructive, in a way that reaches people and draws them in a way that builds trust with its readers in new ways? That's one part of the answer. Can we create forms of fact-checking that people feel confident in? Can we carry it out? So investments in understanding better how to do fact-checking, how to think about that, how to create websites and a fact-checking movement, which you have in some countries, is another part of the answer. Media literacy is another part of the answer. Teaching people how to read and how to understand the news, how to understand what's true and what's not. I think there's going to be a role for tech companies, which will have to, which I think over time will have to make both websites and web posts more transparent, so that when you're looking at something, you know where it comes from and who paid for it, and it's not just an article on the internet. You need some kind of tagging mechanism, and that may happen. And then I also think it's very important that existing laws be applied to Facebook and to Twitter and to and to Google as well. So, for example, in the United States, we have very clear laws about political funding and political advertising, which somehow the tech companies have managed to avoid. And we need to, make sure that the internet spaces are treated as media and not just as some kind of open public space that nobody's in control of. So there are multiple lines that people have to think along, and there is a task for government to think about it, for journalists, also for educators, and many others. I mean, that's actually a long topic, which we can talk about another time.
Hello, I'm Aisha. I have two questions. One, what kind of news got out about the Holodomor to Europe and America while it was happening? How did Marxist ideas, fascist ideas at the time influence the reception of that news and make people care about it or not? My second question is actually, it seems that Alexander Zakharchenko, the leader of the DPR, recently started calling for the requisition of grain and food products, which seems a bit of a kind of a dark echo. What's your thought on that? And do you think he's aware of that echo?
So there is a chapter in my book which describes both the cover-up of the famine, both as it was carried out inside the Soviet Union, but also as it was carried out in the West. And it was very deliberately suppressed. Stalin forbade anyone to mention it, and there was enormous pressure put on Western journalists not to write about it. And at that time, the journalists who were based in Moscow everything they wrote went out by cable, and it was censored, and they were only there by the permission of the state, and so people were very careful about what they said. There were one or two of them who went even further than that and actually suppressed, this is also described in the book, a famous New York Times journalist actually denied the famine in an article that he wrote. It was called "Russians Are Hungry But Not Starving." And he essentially, because he was one of the most famous journalists in his time, it was a very influential and important article. I mean, I would say that the Marxist ideas may have had a little bit of impact in that there was a part of the left in the West that didn't want to hear this story. Remember that we're talking about 1933, which is a year of terrible economic crisis in the West. And so at that moment, people wanted to hear good news from the Soviet Union. They wanted some new hope. Maybe they figured out something we don't know. Maybe they can teach us lessons. Maybe we can learn from them. And so people wanted to hear that from Russia, and they didn't want to hear any bad news. And so that probably also affected the reception of the famine. I think more important, 1933 is also the year when Hitler came to power. And, and you can actually see this, for example, there's an argument that goes on inside the Vatican, and a similar one inside the Foreign Office about whether, because people knew about the famine. They didn't know many details, but they knew something was happening. Should we do something? Should we organize a big relief effort? What should we do? And many people, the counter-argument was, we shouldn't do that now because we might need the Soviet Union in the next couple of years because of this problem with Hitler. And so Ukraine is not just Ukraine, but the Soviet peasants are a kind of victim of geopolitics in the sense that people thought, well, maybe we need Stalin for something else. And this is also a piece of it. So I don't know that it was so much ideology. It was more the lack of the information which Stalin successfully repressed, and it was the fact that it was not in anybody's interest right at that moment to focus on this issue. So I would say those were the two things. I mean, as for the Donetsk leaders requisitioning grain, I mean, look, I have no insight into their thinking. I don't know if they know the history of what they're doing, but yes, that's very creepy.
Thank you. We have time for the last question.
Hello, thank you for your coming and your interesting lecture, as well as for your support. here is my question. After writing your work about investigating of a crime of genocide committed by Soviet Union and its authorities, what shall be your next steps to promote the idea of investigating and recognizing a Holodomor as a crime against the whole Ukrainian nation among your native community?
So I am a historian and a journalist. The discussion and the debate about genocide and whether or not it's a crime is something that politicians and lawyers do. And I'm not really, I don't see myself as being an important part of that debate. I mean, my role was to present the evidence. Here's what happened. Here's my book. If you want to understand what happened, please read it, and then you can decide. I mean, the definition of the term genocide is really, because it's part of international law, it's therefore politicized. And so it will be a political decision of many countries as to how they want to recognize it and take it further.